Revisiting racism in Australia. A few days ago there was a story on the ABC webpage about a candidate in the local elections down there, local government elections. This candidate was subject to racist slurs which were written onto her campaign posters. This was an independent candidate by the name of Jamel Singh, and scrawled onto her campaign poster were the words, "Australia is for Australians. Go home and fix your own country," with the O left out of the last word of that statement. Jamel Singh is an Australian citizen. She's 47 years old, an educator and consultant whose family heritage is from the Punjab and North India, Pakistan, and she's lived in Australia since she was 4 years old. She describes herself as proudly Australian, and she says, I think really significantly, "I am what Australia looks like." A website called All Together Now, which looks at issues of racism in Australia, reports that 40% of children experience racism, mostly at school. And they also report a recent study that found that 43% of non-white Australian employees commonly experience racism at work. An Australian National University paper from 2012 reports, "We find economically and statistically significant differences in callback rates, suggesting that ethnic minority candidates would need to apply for more jobs in order to receive the same number of interviews. These differences vary systematically across groups, with Italians, a more established migrant group, suffering less discrimination than Chinese and Middle Easterners, who've typically arrived more recently." I'll be leaving links to these things in the description below. Many Australians will deny that Australia is a racist nation, but it has a long history of racism. There is, of course, a terrible history with respect to the Indigenous peoples of Australia, and Indigenous people continue to suffer great disadvantages within our society, regardless of any legal equalities that they might have. The White Australia policy, which came into effect at the time of Federation in 1901, was designed to ensure that Australia's population was predominantly Anglo-Celtic. After the war, this policy was slowly dismantled between about 1949 and 1973. In 1966, the then Prime Minister Harold Holt stated that Australia no longer had a White Australia policy, but instead had a restricted immigration policy. In January of 1971, the Prime Minister John Gorton stated that his government aimed to establish a multiracial society in Australia and committed to abolishing racial discrimination. However, he stated that there was still a need to restrict non-white immigration. He had earlier stated that the White Australia policy was not morally justifiable, but that, quote, "the unlimited influx of coloured people would lead to stresses in Australia." The Whitlam government, which followed the Gorton government, a Labor government, implemented a series of amendments preventing the enforcement of racial aspects of the immigration law. These amendments legislated that all migrants, regardless of origin, be eligible to obtain citizenship after 3 years of permanent residence. It ratified all international agreements relating to immigration and race, and it issued policy to totally disregard race as a factor in selecting migrants. The Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 made the use of racial criteria for any official purpose illegal. However, it wasn't until the Fraser Liberal government's review of immigration law in 1978 that all selection of prospective migrants based on country of origin was entirely removed from official policy. In Australia, from the 19th century onwards, each new wave of migrants has been subject to discrimination and racism. The Chinese, South Pacific Islanders, Italians, Greeks, Vietnamese, more recently people from Islamic nations or people who look suspiciously brownish, and today people from African nations. As reported in an Australian Human Rights Commission report from 2020, a survey of 3,000 people by the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the Australian National University indicated that Australians of Asian descent had experienced racist incidents because of COVID-19. It found that almost 85% of Australians of Asian descent surveyed had experienced at least one incident of racism between January and October in 2020. How easily Australians slip back into the old racist patterns of behaviour. The same report states that an Islamophobia register was launched in 2014 and the second report was released in 2019. It documents 349 verified instances of reported Islamophobia between 2016 and 2017. The reported instances were in the physical, in other words the offline world, and in the online world. Of the 202 offline real-world cases, 72% were interpersonal, while the remaining 28% were directed generally at all Muslims, via graffiti and stickers, things like that. Half of these offline cases involved anti-Muslim hate speech, while a quarter actually consisted of vandalism and physical attacks. And these are just a few examples. A friend was telling me just yesterday actually, about a daytime concert that she recently attended. It was attended by an older demographic group. Now, it's become the practice in Australia at the beginning of most public events to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the event is taking place. It's easy for us to forget that wherever mainly white European people have settled and established themselves, they've invariably displaced the indigenous people that previously occupied the land. This opening statement is an acknowledgement of that and a recognition of the indigenous people's continuing connection with that land. At this particular concert, my friend reported, a large proportion of the audience booed when this acknowledgement came over the PA. My friend was shocked, as were we when she told us this story. What possible harm is done to the people at that event by such an acknowledgement? Even if they privately objected to that practice, would it hurt them to stay quiet and keep their objections to themselves, just as a common courtesy? How can it hurt us to be reminded that other people once called that place home, and that we have displaced them, when it's so obviously true? It's a good thing to recognise and acknowledge this. And to actually boo such an acknowledgement is an act of blatant political racism. I don't care who might be upset when I say that. There is in Australian society continuing systematic discrimination against Indigenous people. There is systematic social discrimination in areas such as housing and employment. And there is a deep attitudinal streak of racism which is much more difficult to measure and is usually denied by people with these attitudes. However, there remain times when this bubbles to the surface and what is usually unacknowledged is openly declared, as in the case of the Victorian local government candidate. Maybe it's not a bad thing that this occasionally does emerge into the open, just to remind us that it's there, just below the surface.